I have spent 30 years studying Russian armored doctrine, from the T-80 formations that defended the Fulda Gap through the T-90 deployments in Syria and the hybrid warfare experiments in the Donbass. I have sat in NATO command centers where we modeled every scenario for Russian mechanized operations west of the Dnieper River. Nothing in those 3 decades prepared me for what satellite imagery confirmed on December 8, 2024. 600 T-14 Armata main battle tanks, Russia's most advanced armored platform, deployed to forward assembly areas in Belgorod, Kursk, and Bryansk oblasts in a coordinated operational movement that was completed in under 96 hours. NATO supply lines running through Poland and Romania into western Ukraine were severed by precision strikes on rail junctions, highway bridges, and logistics hubs in a 48-hour interdiction campaign that involved more than 300 cruise missiles and loitering munitions. The flow of ammunition, spare parts, and fuel that has sustained Ukrainian operations for the past 33 months has stopped. And the Biden administration's response for the first 72 hours was paralysis. I want to be honest with you about something. I have reviewed Russian force posture in the theater since the initial invasion in February 2022. I have studied the incremental escalations, the mobilization cycles, the equipment losses, and the industrial base reconstitution that has allowed Russia to sustain offensive operations despite catastrophic casualties and material attrition. What I did not anticipate, was that Russia would commit its most advanced armored platform, a system that has been held in strategic reserve and deployed only in limited numbers for fear of catastrophic loss or capture, to a theater where Ukrainian anti-tank capabilities have destroyed more than 3,000 Russian armored vehicles. This is not a demonstration. This is not posturing. This is the commitment of Russia's premier ground combat system to a decisive operation that Moscow believes will break Ukrainian resistance before NATO can respond. In the next 38 minutes, I am going to walk you through 4 questions that every serious observer of this conflict needs answered. First, how did Russia deploy 600 T-14 Armata tanks to forward positions without triggering a preemptive Ukrainian strike or a NATO response, given that Western intelligence has been monitoring Russian force movements with satellite and signals intelligence for the entire duration of the war? Second, what specific capabilities does the T-14 Armata possess that make it qualitatively different from the T-72, T-80, and T-90 platforms that have been destroyed in large numbers by Ukrainian Javelin, NLAW, and Stugna-P anti-tank systems? Third, how did Russia execute a successful interdiction campaign against NATO supply lines that were supposed to be protected by Ukrainian air defenses and by the operational security that has kept those routes open for nearly 3 years? And fourth, what does this operational escalation mean for the viability of continued Western support for Ukraine and for the broader stability of the European security order? If this is the kind of analysis you have been looking for, the kind that does not manage the narrative to preserve the illusion that Ukraine is winning or that NATO has this situation under control, subscribe and stay with me. Hit like. Drop your assessment in the comments. I read them. What I am about to walk you through is built from satellite imagery, confirmed casualty reports, and open source tracking of Russian rail movements and logistics flows over the past 2 weeks. Let me be precise about this. Phase 1 of the Russian operation began on December 5th. Russian railways moved 6 echelons of flat cars carrying T-14 Armata tanks from storage facilities near Moscow and Nizhny Novgorod to forward rail terminals in Belgorod, Kursk, and Bryansk. Each echelon carried approximately 100 tanks. The movement was conducted at night under electronic warfare coverage that degraded NATO satellite reconnaissance and with operational security protocols that prevented Ukrainian intelligence from detecting the movement until the tanks had already been offloaded at the forward terminals. The Ukrainian General Staff issued a statement on December 7th confirming that Russian forces had deployed a significant number of advanced armored vehicles to the border region but did not specify the type or the number. That statement was an admission that Ukrainian intelligence had been surprised. The T-14 Armata is not a legacy Soviet platform. It is a clean sheet design built around the principle of crew survivability, advanced fire control, and protection against modern anti-tank threats. The tank has an unmanned turret. The crew of 3 sits in an armored capsule in the hull, isolated from the ammunition and the fuel. The turret is equipped with a 125-meter smoothbore gun, an autoloader, and a fire control system that integrates thermal imaging, laser range finding, and ballistic computation. The armor package includes Malachite explosive reactive armor, an active protection system designated Afghanit, and composite armor arrays designed to defeat tandem charge warheads of the type used in the Javelin and Enelaw systems. The Afghanit active protection system is the key differentiator. Afghanit uses a phased array radar to detect incoming projectiles, including missiles and kinetic penetrators. When a threat is detected, the system launches a salvo of fragmentation charges designed to destroy the incoming projectile before it reaches the tank. The system is designed to defeat top attack missiles like the Javelin, which have been the most effective Ukrainian anti-tank weapon in the conflict. Early Russian tests of the Afghanit system conducted at the Alabino Proving Ground demonstrated successful intercepts of simulated Javelin profiles. Whether the system works in operational conditions under sustained fire and against the full range of Western anti-tank systems is the question that this deployment is designed to answer. Stay with me. What comes next is what reveals the strategic intent behind this deployment. Phase 2 of the Russian operation began on December 6th. The Russian aerospace forces and strategic rocket forces launched a coordinated strike campaign targeting NATO supply routes into western Ukraine. The targets were not frontline positions. The targets were the logistics infrastructure that enables the flow of ammunition, fuel, and equipment from Poland and Romania into the combat zone. The Yahodin-Koval rail junction in Volyn Oblast, which handles the majority of Western military aid arriving through Poland, took 11 caliber cruise missile strikes. The rail yard, the marshalling facility, and the fuel depot were destroyed. The junction is offline. The Medica-Shahini border crossing, the primary highway route for overland transport of supplies from Poland, took 7 Garan II loitering munition strikes targeting the bridge over the Western Bug River and the customs facility. The bridge was dropped. The crossing is impassable. The Dorohusk-Yahodin crossing, an alternate route, took 4 strikes and is similarly closed. NATO supplies that were flowing into Ukraine at a rate of approximately 3,000 tons per day through these crossings are now stuck on the Polish side of the border with no viable route forward. The Asaxia-Orlivka ferry crossing on the Danube, which connects Romania to Odessa Oblast, took 9 Onyx anti-ship missile strikes. The ferry terminal, the loading ramps, and 2 of the ferries themselves were destroyed. The crossing, which handled approximately 800 tons per day of supplies, is no longer operational. The cumulative effect of these strikes is that the 3 primary NATO supply routes into western Ukraine have been severed. The supplies are arriving at the Polish and Romanian borders, but they are not reaching Ukrainian forces. I want you to understand what that means. The Ukrainian military has been dependent on Western ammunition, particularly 155mm artillery shells, Javelin anti-tank missiles, and Stinger anti-aircraft missiles to sustain defensive operations. The Ukrainian domestic production capacity for these systems is negligible. The stockpiles that Ukraine accumulated in the first year of the war have been exhausted. The current burn rate for 155mm artillery ammunition is approximately 6,000 rounds per day. The current stockpile remaining in country, based on Ukrainian General Staff disclosures, is sufficient for approximately 12 to 18 days of sustained operations at current intensity. If the supply routes remain closed for more than 2 weeks, Ukrainian artillery units will begin to run out of ammunition. When that happens, the Ukrainian ability to conduct defensive fires against Russian mechanized assaults collapses. Let me tell you something about the logistical arithmetic of this war. NATO countries have collectively delivered more than $200 billion in military aid to Ukraine since February 2022. The majority of that aid is consumable. It is ammunition, fuel, medical supplies, and spare parts that are used and must be continuously replenished. The delivery of that aid depends on a handful of border crossings and rail junctions. Russia has known the locations of those crossings and junctions since the beginning of the conflict. Russia has chosen not to strike them until now because the political and military calculus was that disrupting NATO supply lines would trigger a direct NATO response. That calculus has changed. Phase 3 of the Russian operation is the concentration of the T-14 Armata formations in forward assembly areas. Satellite imagery from December 9th shows approximately 200 T-14 tanks in revetments and camouflage positions near Belgorod, within 20 kilometers of the Ukrainian border. An additional 200 are visible near Kursk. The remaining 200 are dispersed across smaller assembly areas in Bryansk Oblast. The formations are being supported by fuel trucks, ammunition carriers, and mobile maintenance facilities. The operational signature is consistent with final preparations for a mechanized offensive. The likely axis of advance is through Kharkiv Oblast toward the city of Kharkiv itself, which is the second largest city in Ukraine and a key logistics hub for Ukrainian operations in the Eastern Theater. Kharkiv is approximately 40 kilometers from the Russian border. The terrain between the border and the city is relatively flat, with limited natural obstacles. Ukrainian defensive positions in the region are well prepared, with anti-tank ditches, minefields, and prepared firing positions for anti-tank guided missiles. But those defenses were designed to stop Russian mechanized formations equipped with T-72 and T-90 tanks, not T-14 Armata tanks with active protection systems. Before we go further, you need to understand the cost versus cost arithmetic. A T-14 Armata tank costs the Russian Ministry of Defense approximately $4 to $5 million per unit based on publicly disclosed procurement contracts. A Javelin anti-tank missile, which is the primary Ukrainian weapon for destroying Russian armor, costs the U.S. Department of Defense approximately $175,000 per round. If the Afghan active protection system works as designed and defeats top attack missiles like the Javelin, then the cost calculus shifts dramatically. Instead of a $175,000 missile destroying a $4 million tank, you have a $4 million tank surviving multiple $175,000 missile strikes and continuing to operate. That is the operational bet that Russia is making with this deployment. Phase 4 of the Russian operation is informational and psychological. Russian state media has begun broadcasting footage of the T-14 Armata tanks on the move, accompanied by commentary from Russian military analysts describing the deployment as a necessary response to NATO escalation and as a demonstration of Russia's technological superiority over Western equipment. The messaging is directed at two audiences. The first audience is domestic. The deployment of the T-14, which has been a symbol of Russian military modernization for more than a decade, is intended to reassure the Russian public that the military has advanced capabilities that can compete with the West. The second audience is NATO. The message is that Russia retains the ability to escalate, that Russia is not deterred by Western aid to Ukraine, and that any further escalation by NATO will be met with a proportional or disproportionate Russian response. The Biden administration's response has been muted. The initial statement from the White House, released on December 9th, acknowledged reports of Russian force movements near the Ukrainian border and reiterated the U.S. commitment to supporting Ukraine. The statement did not specify what additional aid would be provided. It did not threaten direct U.S. military intervention. It did not announce any change in the rules of engagement for Ukrainian forces using American-provided weapons. The statement was a placeholder, not a policy. The delay in formulating a coherent response is driven by two factors. First, the Biden administration is constrained by domestic political realities. Congressional support for Ukraine funding has eroded significantly over the past year. The midterm elections produced a divided Congress in which a significant faction of the Republican Party opposes continued funding for Ukraine. Any request for additional emergency appropriations to replenish Ukrainian stockpiles will face significant opposition. Second, the administration is constrained by the operational reality that there is no immediate military response available that does not risk direct confrontation with Russia. Providing additional Javelin missiles to Ukraine does not solve the problem if the supply routes are cut. Conducting airstrikes against Russian forces in Russia would constitute a direct NATO-Russia conflict that no one in Washington is prepared to authorize. I have said for years in testimony before the Senate Armed Services Committee and in private conversations with senior officials that the sustainability of Western support for Ukraine depends on the logistics network that delivers that support. I have warned that the network is vulnerable, that it depends on a small number of choke points, and that Russia has the capability to disrupt it if Moscow decides that the strategic value of doing so outweighs the risks. That warning was acknowledged, but the assumption inside the Pentagon and inside the State Department was that Russia would not risk NATO retaliation by striking those choke points. That assumption was wrong. What happened between December 5th and December 9th is not an isolated escalation. It is the manifestation of a Russian strategic decision that the costs of allowing NATO to continue arming Ukraine indefinitely outweigh the risks of a direct confrontation with NATO over the supply routes. Putin has studied NATO decision-making during the Ukraine conflict. He has observed that NATO has been unwilling to escalate beyond the provision of weapons and intelligence. He has concluded that there is a threshold of Russian action below which NATO will not respond kinetically, and he has calculated that disrupting the supply routes falls below that threshold. The broader strategic implication of this crisis extends across Europe. In Warsaw, in Bucharest, and in the Baltic capitals, the Russian strikes on NATO supply routes are being interpreted as a direct challenge to the alliance's ability to support a partner state in a conflict with Russia. If NATO cannot keep the supply routes into Ukraine open, then the implicit message is that NATO cannot defend its own eastern members against Russian aggression. The psychological effect of that perception, whether accurate or not, is that it undermines confidence in Article 5 and in the credibility of American security guarantees. In Berlin and Paris, the Russian escalation is being viewed as an opportunity to pursue a diplomatic off-ramp. There is a growing faction within the German and French governments that believes continued military support for Ukraine is unsustainable, that Ukraine cannot win a war of attrition against Russia, and that the responsible course of action is to negotiate a ceasefire that preserves Ukrainian independence in exchange for territorial concessions in the East. That faction has been marginalized over the past 2 years, but the Russian strikes on the supply routes and the deployment of the T-14 Armata tanks are providing ammunition for the argument that the military situation is deteriorating and that diplomacy is the only viable path forward. For Ukraine, the implications are existential. The Zelensky government has staked its legitimacy on the promise that Western support will continue until Ukrainian territorial integrity is restored. The disruption of the supply routes undermines that promise. If Ukrainian forces begin to run out of ammunition, if the artillery stops firing, if the anti-tank missiles are exhausted, then the Ukrainian ability to hold defensive positions collapses. The Russian mechanized offensive, when it comes, will break through. And once the front line collapses, there is no fallback position that can be held with the resources currently available to the Ukrainian military. For the United States, the crisis exposes the limits of the strategy that has guided American policy toward Ukraine since the beginning of the conflict. The strategy has been to provide enough aid to Ukraine to prevent a Russian victory, but not enough aid to enable a Ukrainian victory, with the intent of grinding down Russian military power over time while avoiding a direct NATO-Russia confrontation. That strategy depends on the logistics network remaining intact. If the network is cut, the strategy collapses, and the United States is left with a choice between escalation, meaning direct military intervention to reopen the supply routes, or accommodation, meaning acceptance that Ukraine will lose territory and that Russian influence in Eastern Europe will expand. Hold that thought. I want to come back to a point I made earlier about the T-14 Armata's active protection system. The Afghanet system is not invulnerable. It has a finite magazine. It can engage a limited number of incoming threats before it needs to be reloaded. In a saturation attack scenario where multiple anti-tank missiles are fired simultaneously at a single tank, the system can be overwhelmed. But the Ukrainians do not have the stockpile of anti-tank missiles necessary to conduct saturation attacks across the entire front. The current inventory of Javelin missiles in Ukrainian hands is estimated at fewer than 1/500 rounds. If Russia commits 600 T-14 tanks to the offensive, and if each tank requires 3 to 5 Javelin missiles to guarantee a kill, then Ukraine needs between 1,800 and 3,000 missiles to stop the offensive. Those missiles do not exist in country, and with the supply routes cut, they cannot be delivered. The United States is now in a position where it must decide whether to authorize direct strikes against Russian logistics infrastructure inside Russia using American long-range missiles fired from Ukrainian territory in an attempt to degrade the offensive before it begins. That decision has been deferred for the past 33 months because of the escalation risk. Striking targets inside Russia using American weapons crosses a threshold that could trigger a Russian response against NATO territory. The Biden administration has consistently declined to authorize such strikes. Whether that policy holds in the face of the current crisis is the question that will define the trajectory of the war over the next 30 days. I read every comment on this channel. The question I see most frequently is whether NATO should intervene directly to reopen the supply routes into Ukraine. Let me address that directly. Direct NATO intervention would require airstrikes against Russian positions inside Russia, potentially including air defense systems, command and control nodes, and logistics facilities. Those strikes would constitute an act of war. Russia would respond. The form of that response could range from conventional strikes against NATO bases in Poland and Romania to the use of tactical nuclear weapons against NATO formations to a broader escalation that draws in the entire alliance. No NATO member state is prepared to accept that level of risk for the sake of keeping the Ukrainian supply routes open. The least bad option, which appears to be the option that Washington is pursuing, is to provide Ukraine with additional intelligence support to enable Ukrainian strikes against the Russian logistics network inside Russia using Ukrainian-operated weapons while pursuing a diplomatic track that seeks a ceasefire before the Russian mechanized offensive begins. That option does not solve the immediate problem, which is that the supply routes are cut and Ukrainian stockpiles are depleting, but it avoids the direct NATO-Russia confrontation that no one wants. The human cost of this crisis is still being compiled, but the trajectory is clear. If the Russian mechanized offensive proceeds, and if Ukrainian forces are unable to stop it because they have run out of anti-tank missiles and artillery ammunition, then the casualty figures will be catastrophic. Ukrainian defensive positions that have held for months will be overrun. Ukrainian units will be encircled and destroyed, and the civilian population in the path of the offensive, including the city of Kharkiv, with a population of 4 million, will be subjected to the same kind of destruction that has been inflicted on Mariupol, Bakhmut, and Avdiivka. I want you to understand that the soldiers who will die in this offensive are not abstractions. They are Ukrainian conscripts who were mobilized to defend their country. They are professional soldiers who have been holding the line for 33 months. They have families, they have communities, they have lives that will be ended because the logistics network that was supposed to sustain them has been cut, and because the Western governments that promised to support them indefinitely are now paralyzed by the fear of escalation. The question I want to leave you with is this. If Russia can sever NATO's supply lines into Ukraine and can deploy advanced armored formations that Ukrainian forces may not be able to stop, what prevents Moscow from continuing this pattern of escalation until Ukraine is forced to accept a negotiated settlement on Russian terms? And if NATO cannot credibly deter or respond to this escalation, what does that mean for the security of NATO's eastern members and for the future of the European security order? Leave your assessment in the comments. I read everyone. If this analysis delivered the hard operational reality that you were looking for, share it, hit like, subscribe. The next update is already in preparation, and what is coming will test every assumption about NATO's cohesion and credibility. I will see you in the next.